I'm curious, before I get started, raise your hand, particularly like if you're a student or you otherwise have not heard of Apache Tomcat. If so, all right, 2 guys. I'll just give you a 60-second explanation. Apache Tomcat is a Java web application server. It's a web server as well. If you just want to serve web content, usually you'd use something like Apache HTTPD, Nginx. I suppose Squid can do it too. IIS if you're on Windows. But generally speaking, Tomcat is intended to host a rich application which has its own code and services and things like that bundled with it. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about not just locking down Tomcat itself, but how things that Tomcat provides can help you lock down your own web application, which is almost more important because usually the security problems are with your web application, not with the framework that it's running in. All right, so I'll go ahead and actually get started. For those of you who are interested, I'm an ASF member. I'm on the Tomcat PMC, the Project Management Committee, and I'm a member of the security team as well. So this is an example of how not to architect security in your web application, and I'm aware that I'm standing between you and my slides. The slides are not all that exciting, and the slides are available online right now, so if you want to follow along and you can't see these, I'll back up real fast. And of course, you can't see the URLs for the slides because it's below my legs. Anyway, don't bother taking pictures or anything like that. They're not that exciting. So I'll try to stay out of your way or wander back and forth. So a lot of people will build their application. They'll deploy that application, celebrate, go out and have drinks with their coworkers, and then go back to it later and say, oh, hey, we should put that security magic sauce on the top. We'll sprinkle the fairy dust on top. You know, we'll pay a couple $1 million a year and have a security company just add security to our product. How hard could it be? Yes, exactly. That doesn't really work. So what you really have to do is you have to understand how to build security into your application and your infrastructure from the very beginning. You can retrofit it. But if you think about this from the beginning, your application and your environment, and therefore your customers, your users, and yourself, because you don't want to get pages all the time, especially in the middle of the night. And I go to sleep very soundly every night because I like to think I do a good job. At any rate, something that a lot of people don't end up doing is a sober risk assessment. They might go through a checklist. Yeah. I was required to do this by some regulatory body or something like that. But I sat down one day to do a real risk assessment, what I thought of as a practical risk assessment of my application, my deployment, my environment. And I came up with a lot of crazy stuff that you wouldn't come up with if you just went through maybe a standard tool. And I was looking, I always think in a very paranoid way, and I was thinking about things like, what if my closest coworker decides that she wants to take us down as an organization? How can I protect my organization from somebody who not only wants to do bad things, but also is privileged to do so? And when you start thinking of crazy scenarios like that, you start thinking a little bit differently about how you architect security. And another thing is, you always see these network diagrams where there's a circle over here, and there's like the crown jewels are in the circle, and then there's this big cloud, and that's the big bad internet out here. And there's this fallacy that the circle is somehow keeping the bad guys out. There are bad guys inside, or there can be bad guys inside. And so what you need to do is mentally erase that circle from around there and just understand that in a network-connected environment, the threat can come from anywhere, including inside. So keep that in mind as I continue to go through these. So it's important to consider your approach to security in a layered way. You can't just sort of sprinkle it on the top like, well, I almost said icing. You don't really sprinkle icing on a cake. You sort of spread it on. But anyway, I'm going to run through a bunch of things today that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but then I am going to get into the server software and the application. So a couple of these are quick. Pay attention to your physical security. The site where your servers are hosted, the room where your servers are hosted, the cage. We had a infrastructure provider that gave us a series of racks that were all in the same cage right on top of one another. And I called them one day and I said, hey, if something really terrible happens and like some knucklehead puts their big gulp on top of the cage and tips it over, how many of our servers are going to be destroyed by that event? And they said, every one of them. And I said, would you mind please putting those in 2 separate cages? This is stupid stuff, but it happens. There's physical network security that you have to think about, whether your applications are public facing, whether they're internally facing, and how you segment your networks. A lot of people like to use VLANs, they like to use VPNs, they do all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't like any of those ideas because when you start using VLANs, actually VLAN's not a bad idea, but when you start relying on network segmentation for security, that's where I think you make mistakes. I have a tenet that I try to espouse in everybody that I talk to and everybody that I work with, which is there should be no such thing as a privileged network position. If you are at a coffee shop, you should have no fewer privileges than if you are sitting in the data center with your network jack plugged into the same switch that my server is on. I should trust you equally, that is not trust you at all. Operating system, user groups, access control lists. Keep your OS up to date. You cannot have a secure application if your operating system is leaky. We have people coming to the Tomcat mailing list all the time saying, hey, I've got this application, it's running on Windows Server 2002 Service Pack 3, and we're running on Java 1.5 and a version of Tomcat that wasn't even called Tomcat, and we're having some kind of network problem. The first thing we say is, what the hell are you doing on that old version? Like, literally upgrade everything you have, because it doesn't matter what else is going on with your application. You need to be on the latest versions of all of these things. These things are so old, nobody's even bothering writing CVEs for them anymore. They're leaky as hell, and probably the bad guys know how to get into these things. So please, upgrade everything, and then come back to us with your original problem, because you're just making the internet a worse place to be. And then remove everything from the server that you don't need. I have mixed feelings about Docker, but the one thing that's nice is you have a thing which has exactly what your application needs and nothing else. And there's value in having the cleanest possible environment that you can have. As for Tomcat itself, Tomcat should have a user that's dedicated to it. Don't use a root user. You need to protect your configuration files. They should be readable but not writable. Again, this goes back to the layered approach to security. If you get hacked, you don't want the bad guys rewriting your config files to install bizarre services that do God knows what. It's bad enough that they get to read all your stuff. They get to write all your stuff. That's bad news too. Unfortunately, there's one directory that Tomcat needs write access to, and that's the work directory. It's possible to run Tomcat in a read-only way, but the performance is pretty bad. So if you want to be extra secure, you can run with a essentially ephemeral deployment. That's something you're interested in, come ask us on the mailing list. So now we get to the real meat, which is the server software. So that I will divide the rest of my time discussing Tomcat configuration and services versus your web application. So Tomcat's pretty darn secure out of the box. If you grab the tarball or the zip file or there's a Windows installer, if you just put that on your server and fire it up, it's pretty inert. You actually have to install a web application into it to do anything. The manager web application, which is one that allows you to control and deploy other services and things like that that are installed in the server, that's available, But there are no users defined. There's a user database file that has some examples in it. If you take out all the comments, it won't start because we've intentionally put an illegal character inside of there. You have to really try to open that thing up. And so we're trying to force you to read the documentation to make sure that you're doing something that makes sense. Let's see. The file permissions are sane. So if you unzip that thing or you untar it as the Tomcat user and then you log out and come in as yourself, you shouldn't be able to read those files. So if you've done everything the way that you're supposed to do it, it should be fairly secure. One thing that is debatable is whether or not the ports are secure. I mean, the whole idea is it's a network server, so the ports that are open are intended to be open so you can access them. I'll get to one in particular that you must lock down if you really don't trust people who are able to log into your local server. So one of the best ways to stay secure is to stay current, and that's not unique to Tomcat, obviously, but we put a release out on we have actually four. We have 4 currently supported versions. No, we sunsetted 6. So we have 7, 8.5, and 9. 7 is essentially in maintenance mode, so we have releases every maybe 3 months or so. For 8.5 and 9, we have releases almost monthly. And usually there is at least a minor security contribution to those, even if it's something like, okay, we updated to a latest library which fixed some minor bug or something like that. A little later I'll talk about how you need to become an expert at deploying things in order to stay current. But it's actually not that hard. So Tomcat has some potentially dangerous features. I'll talk about the security manager, the connectors, authentication, and services. And I'm sorry I'm moving really fast, but I am aware of how little time I have. I usually do these things in about 50 minutes, so I had to chop this guy in half. There are some services that Tomcat can provide. There's Session JNDI or LDAP and JDBC, which would be for database connections, and then clustering, which allows swarms of Tomcat servers to serve your application in a way that they all communicate together. So Tomcat has some sharp edges, and one of them is there's a connector called the APR connector. Historically, it's the one that everybody used because long time ago, the network stack for Java was not very good, and the only way that you could get something that would actually perform very well was to use a native connector. APR stands for Apache Portable Runtime. It's the same connector that HTTPD uses. So if you want to run the exact same code that Apache HTTPD is using, you can do that. It turns out these days it's not really that much of an advantage. You get some advantages when you're using TLS because you can use the OpenSSL library instead of Java JSSE. JSSE has some performance issues. However, we have built an OpenSSL JSSE provider. So now you can use Java, NIO, and NIO2 along with OpenSSL, and all those TLS performance issues go out the window. The reason that APR and TC native are still a little bit of, I would consider, a sharp edge is because any native code running in your JVM is a liability. When Java's network stack falls over, you get an exception. When APR falls over, you usually get a process termination, and that's no fun for anybody. Tomcat supports, I mentioned earlier, the manager app that lets you deploy new applications, take applications down. That's pretty much, that gives you the keys to the kingdom. If you can deploy a new web application, you can deploy an evil one. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of called, I think it's called MS Venom. It's a war file. You put it up there and you get a shell onto the server. So guess what? If your manager application is available to anyone over the network, they've owned your machine already. So be careful. Server-side includes and the CGI servlet, those are basically built-in remote code execution managers, right? CGI servlet is intended to run scripts on your server. Theoretically, those scripts should be packaged with your application, so make sure that they are safe, but just be aware that in order to execute that thing, you're leaving the JVM. Anytime you leave the JVM, you're at the mercy of whatever the operating system does or does not want to do with that. Microsoft Windows specifically has some real problems with how it dispatches and creates new processes. And so if you don't know what you're doing, you can open yourself up to security vulnerabilities that you might not have even thought of. I'm not going to talk about JMX right now. So with a Tomcat install, I mentioned that the manager's in there. There's something called a host manager, which allows you to define virtual hosts. If you don't need these things, get rid of them. In fact, one of the best things, one of the best pieces of advice that I like to give to people who are doing admin for Tomcat is what's called a split configuration. You install Tomcat in one directory, the whole kit and caboodle, including the Tomcat or the host manager and the manager and the example application and the default application, all this stuff. And then what you do is you create another directory over here called my actual deployment. And when you launch Tomcat, you say, use this code, but this is where my configuration is, and this is where my deployment is. And it's completely fresh. What that allows you to do is you can install a new version of Tomcat in a different directory. You take your process down, point to the new one, bring it right back up. You're down for 5 seconds, and you have the new version of Tomcat. If things don't go well, you bring it down, you point it to the old version and bring it right back up. You have 10 total seconds of downtime, and you're fine. So if you do that kind of thing, the applications are removed for you. You have to take action in order to add those applications back in. Java has a thing called a security manager, which tries to prevent your processes from attacking themselves. Tomcat works great with the security manager. I've never seen an application that has not had an issue with a security manager running, because it does all kinds of crazy things, like it won't let you open ports, outgoing, so you can't make outgoing connections. You can't write to the disk. You can't read from the disk. You can't look at system properties. There's a whole bunch of things that you're not allowed to do, and that's very good, actually. But what it requires you to do is run your application in a way that it's just going to fail over and over again as you discover those things that are necessary for its operation. And you have this huge laundry list of then white-listed activities that it's allowed to perform. So I would recommend looking into the security manager for Java, but just understand that it's going to be a long process of trying to exercise your entire application. And it might prevent some things from working correctly. Tomcat has a handful of connectors. I threw some alphabet soup at you earlier about NIO and APR and NIO2 and things like that. Those are different models for I/O, whether they're synchronous or asynchronous. Actually, everything's asynchronous now. Those connectors are how Tomcat communicates with the outside world. So how it accepts a connection, how it handles that connection internally and passes off the bytes and shuttles the bytes between the network and your application. Something that you might want to do with those connectors is decide which network interface to use. You can use all network interfaces or the quad 0, which allows any outside communication, or you can bind to a local interface like localhost. If you do localhost, that limits what you can do, but it also means that you have some flexibility for other types of connections. If you want to do some kind of secure, like S-tunnel connection from another host, you would probably want to bind to the local host. Keep that in mind when you're doing your deployment. Consider IP filtering, either for the entire server or just for your web application. That's something Tomcat can do for you. Consider putting a reverse proxy out in front of your application. What's nice about reverse proxies is if you don't trust Java or you don't trust your application, you can put a web application firewall out there Mod security is a great thing. There are all kinds of WAFs that you can use for that kind of purpose. I could do a whole lecture on TLS. Right now, I'll just say use it for everything. And I want to point out AJP, which is a protocol that used to be used almost exclusively to proxy between HTTPD and Tomcat JServe back in the day. It does not provide encryption, and it's a very important thing that you need to know. So now some actual to-dos. I would like to take a second to point out all this stuff is online on the Tomcat Security How-To webpage. There's no new information that I'm presenting here really today. But it's just sort of like a list of things to consider, not only in my presentation, but also on the website. So this is more of a get your feet wet, and if you have questions, come to the mailing list, please, and I'll give a reference to that later. So protect the shutdown port with a password. I mentioned earlier that Tomcat is pretty much secure out of the box. The only problem is there's a shutdown port. If you type telnet localhost 8005, press enter, type the word shutdown and press enter, boom, your server goes down. It's hilarious if it's your buddy who's running the server. It's not funny if it's happening to you in production. So you can disable that port, or you can set a password for it. And this is how you set a password for it, up there at the top. You can protect the AJP port with a password. This isn't what you think it is, but it's not a bad idea if you have your AJP port available to the outside world. That basically means an incoming AJP connection, which is not HTTP, but it proxies it, can't come from an arbitrary source. Those passwords need to agree. So it doesn't actually provide encryption, but it does provide a certain amount of authentication. Speaking of authentication, and I'm talking about username and password, Tomcat provides several backends. You can use a file-based authenticator, JDBC or LDAP, and then JASPIC is, it's actually a whole JSR, which just handles authentication. So it's sort of a superset of all of these other things. I just wanted to point out that Tomcat can, for your application, handle your credential security for you. It can provide hashing and key derivation function access, and a modern Tomcat is much better than what it used to ship with years ago when MD5 was what was considered reasonable. I'm done? All right. I think I have one more slide. I'll skip the clustering. All right. A few things that Tomcat can actually provide for you. Don't roll your own authentication. That's what I just mentioned. Couple of, these are all valves or filters that come bundled with Tomcat. And they are very, very easy to configure. So I would suggest if you're interested in DOS protection, anybody interested in DOS protection? CSRF protection, CORS sharing, and then this thing called the HTTP header security filter. It's a mishmash of different RFCs and internet standards that people have determined are good practices. Look into using those things, and they're all configurable through there. That is actually security that you can kind of sprinkle on the top. Use HTTPS everywhere. Always run the latest version of everything. And I can't stress this enough, write an auditing plan and actually look at what you've done. So after you've made plans to do things properly, go back and check that they were actually done properly. Real-time monitoring is a really good idea for this. Here's a list of tools. I won't even leave this up on the screen because I'll leave the next slide up, which is the resources, including the URL for this presentation. Tomcat has some great resources itself. The website is fairly well documented. It's got access to all the mailing lists, and the user's mailing list is very well traveled. If you post a question on that mailing list, you should probably expect an answer back in about an hour. So if anybody's interested in learning more about these kinds of things, don't hesitate to find me in the hallway, find me on the mailing list, however you can reach me. Do I have time for questions?
You do.
I think I have about 2 minutes.
I think you should ask people. Who knows what Cunningham's Law is? Anybody?
Anybody know what Cunningham's Law is?
Do Do you know what it is?
I don't.
It's the post the wrong answer on the internet to get the right one.
The answer to that was post the wrong answer on the internet to get the right one. Yeah, I like that. Did anybody have any general or specific questions? Back here, Sean.
Performance penalty for Java Security Manager.
The performance, I really don't know what the performance penalty is for the Java Security Manager. It's non-zero, but I don't think it's awful. I think if you're really worried about your application, either your application being subverted to do bad things, or if you're in an environment where you're hosting untrusted applications, it's probably well worth your time to make it work. It's no Spectre mitigation. But yeah, I mean, it takes time to do all those ACL checks. There was a question back here? Yeah, sir.
What's your opinion on how to secure things like Spring Boot, for example, that embed Tomcat? And a lot of these configuration files are not easily provided or reachable.
Okay, so the question was, if you use something like Spring Boot, which is an embedded use of Tomcat, so the application then boots an instance of Tomcat inside of it with its own configuration, and the application is sort of both hosted inside and wrapping around Tomcat. How would I recommend architecting security for that? Unfortunately, it's really application specific. You're right, the configuration files are buried inside of that mess, and generally speaking, they're not the standard configuration files that come with Tomcat. They're very highly customized. The good news is, because you both wrap and are inside of Tomcat, you can pick and choose the types of security features Tomcat provides in order to do that kind of thing. So if you have an application that you're writing, it's up to you. If you have an application that you're running that came from a vendor, talk to the vendor about those things and just say, hey, what does our denial of service protection look like? Are we protected against cross-site request forgery? We have to have cross-origin communication. How do we configure that kind of thing? So they need to make that available to you. I think I have time maybe for one more question before Kevin throws me off.
Gotta get.
It's got the hook. All right, thanks everybody, I appreciate it.
Big hand for Chris, thank you.
You can